Hi, welcome to the lesson planning template. This is a template that our department uses, and what I have done is I've taken the template and then I've designed a lesson plan around what we would be covering in Chapter 4, which is preparing for learning in your tech. So you have the lesson plan template, and then you have some examples of what that lesson plan would look like if we were actually planning for a particular lesson. So if we start up at the top, you can see teacher name, date, grade level, age of student or group. I don't have that filled out. If I were teaching in a public school setting, I certainly would have that completed. But if we move down to the first category, which says lesson plan subject, well, our lesson plan is going to be based around Chapter 4, which is preparing for learning. So in blue font there I have, a blue print, I have preparing for learning. If we move down to the second category, Georgia Performance Standards and Appropriate Elements, well, since this is a college course, I don't have to correlate this to the Georgia Performance Standards, but if I were teaching at an elementary, middle, or high school level, I certainly would list the Georgia Performance Standards that I would be covering in this particular lesson. If we move down to the third element, where it says Focus Topic Graphic Organizer, at Young Harris College, in our lesson plan template, we require students to create a graphic organizer which illustrates conceptually or graphically what will be covered in the lesson plan. So what I did is I just took the graphic organizer that was at the beginning of your PowerPoint, and which this graphic organizer identifies what will be covered in lesson planning, and I place that in that location. The next part of the lesson plan is the main idea or unit understanding objectives. Basically, what do you want students to know or be able to do as a result of the lesson? So you can see that in looking at the concept of lesson planning and using the PowerPoint that you have observed or seen, I've listed some of the objectives, such as students will be able to identify the factors and descriptions of influencing instructional planning. Students will be able to define learner outcomes and assessment. Students will be able to associate Ralph Tyler as the father of lesson planning. Given 6 items, students will be able to correctly identify which item is associated with either the cognitive, affective, or psychomotor domains with 100% accuracy, and the students will be made aware of the components of a lesson plan. So those are the general objectives that I identified for this particular lesson. Now, another element of a lesson plan is once you've identified your objectives, what questions will you ask or pose? And generally those questions are low as well as high order. And oftentimes those objectives will play off of the, oftentimes those questions will be directly related to the objectives that you set. So these were some questions that I listed that I thought would be important to include during this lesson plan. What's the purpose of a lesson plan? What are the factors that influence lesson planning, and why are these factors important? What are the learner outcomes and why are they important? What is the purpose of an assessment? Who is Ralph Taylor, and what 4 questions did he develop for lesson planning? What domains comprise learning? What are the components of a lesson plan? How can the components of a lesson plan be applied to a real lesson? So I have a mixture of low as well as high order questions, and I would be using those questions throughout the presentation of the lesson. The next piece is what instructional strategies will be used, and I gave you some examples there: cooperative learning, direct instruction, mastery learning, and also Chapter 7 and 8 can be helpful in listing those as well. Well, I've listed 2. I would be using most likely direct instruction, and then I would probably have a cooperative learning activity, a pair share, possibly a jigsaw activity that I would include in this lesson. Materials that I would need would be a PowerPoint, cooperative learning jigsaw organizer, I would require the text be used, and also that the students bring laptops. So those are the materials that would be used. Now, as you learned when we talked about the pedagogical cycle, if we go to the next segment, we're talking about motivation. How are we going to draw students into the lesson? Well, I would connect the lesson to real life. Ask the students a question or give them a scenario in which they have to plan, and would want to use that motivation element to help students understand that a lesson plan is no different than when we plan to get up in the morning, when we plan our day, when we plan an event or activity, that the lesson planning is a natural thing to do. So I would have something at the beginning of the lesson that would make that connection for students. I also would have a video from Stephen Covey called Beginning with the End in Mind, and I would use that to have students become aware of the fact that all things are created twice. We have the mental creation, and then we have the actual physical creation. And in creating a lesson plan, that's sort of the mental work that we do before we actually physically implement a lesson. So those would be two elements I would use, or two ideas that I would utilize to motivate students at the beginning part of the lesson. Then this next segment, learning activity steps and the sequence, this is very important because basically this identifies the steps that will be involved in carrying out the lesson. So I'll start off with the motivation. I'll then move into the PowerPoint to provide that background knowledge. I will then have students involved in a cooperative learning activity. I will facilitate, I will describe that activity, and then number 4, I will facilitate them into that activity. And then number 5, I'll have some type of reflection to evaluate the lesson. So learning activity steps and sequence is very critical because it basically shows you the order in which the lesson will be carried out. Then I'd have a summary review. I would plan to, at the end of the lesson, have a group reflection, ask them to reflect on the lesson, what went well, what should have been done differently in the lesson, and then I will have a ticket to get out, asking students to share one thing that stood out for them in the lesson. In evaluation, I'll have a 10-point quiz, and this will function as a formative assessment and a review. And the quiz would cover whatever specific topic or topics that I would be covering that day in that lesson. And very well might ask what are the components of a lesson plan, and then maybe have some questions related to the domains. Now the next 2 segments, how is the lesson being modified from regular lesson? If I were to have learners with special needs, perhaps students with learning disabilities, then I would fill something out there in that category. I might have an activity that they might do. I might have them do an assignment that might be a little bit different than the rest of the class. I might provide them with some one-on-one assistance during part of the lesson if it was needed. Same thing goes for the next category, what accommodations are being considered. Again, if I had students that had special needs, perhaps they might need more time. Maybe they would need to take something home with them to work on and bring back the next day. They might need special assistance. I would fill that out there in that area. How will technology be integrated? Again, I'll use a PowerPoint. Students will use laptops to create lesson plans, identify resources, and then I would possibly have them access web resources. How could a paraprofessional assist? Well, that's not applicable in this particular situation, but again, if I had students with special needs and I was in a regular classroom, I might have them assisting that student. And then the last part of the lesson plan is just the reflection after the students have left and perhaps in the evening. How effective, these are the questions I would ask, how effective was the lesson? Were students successful in meeting the objectives? What evidence can I show that the students understood what I taught? How effective was my assessment for assessing the information that students obtained during the lesson, and then what would I do differently if I had a chance to do that lesson over again. So you can see that there are many steps in a lesson plan, but if you take your time and you go through each one of these steps, think about how each step is going to impact your ability to share information or engage students in learning, then this type of lesson plan or this type of format can be very helpful and to you, not only to you but also to students. Also keep in mind that if this were to be a unit plan, I probably would have 10 lessons that would comprise the unit. Again, this lesson probably would cover at least 2 class periods and possibly even a third class period, depending on the assessment and the reflection time and those kinds of things. It's always important to overplan, which I tend to always do, and as opposed to underplan. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and hope you have a better understanding of what a lesson plan is, what are the components of the lesson plan, and what the teacher role is in planning for a particular lesson.